Are we slipping in our intellectual abilities? Have we lost the ability to read, reason, analyze, and most importantly, pay attention? Over the past decade, our lives have seen a deluge of challenges, from COVID-19 and how it disrupted education, to the rising use of screens and smartphones, to the most recent threat from AI, LLMs, and an increasingly proficient set of AI tools that threaten to compete with and ultimately replace humans in almost every dimension. Each of these threats is nuanced and subjective, but we are starting to see patterns emerge in terms of the impact on our attention span and our ability to think critically and absorb new information. In light of this worrying development, I was particularly interested in reading the LinkedIn posts of Carolina Pacheco-Punceles, who I'm delighted to welcome to this podcast. She's a behavioral economist. She calls herself an AI survival kit creator, an executive function strategist, and her LinkedIn bio states that she is equipping humans with the skills to think clearly, lead wisely, and thrive in a disrupted world. We connected over LinkedIn when she was responding to a post by Jonathan Haidt, author of The Anxious Generation, about the erosion of attention spans and the ability to pay attention. And we shared experiences about how we could address the slide. Welcome, Carolina. Thank you for joining me here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a total pleasure to be part of your team.
Well, before we dive in, I wanted to give you a bit more context on why I thought Carolina's perspective would be so valuable and so critical today. In mid-March of this year, 2025, the Financial Times ran a striking data-driven essay called Have Humans Passed Peak Brain Power? It highlighted that reading, reasoning, and problem-solving scores across teens and adults have been on a decade-long decline with an inflection point around 2012. Jonathan Haidt himself had flagged the piece on LinkedIn as a stunning essay on the international decline in the ability to read, reason, focus, and learn new things, and had noted in that essay that it had accelerated since the early 2010s. In Carolina's comments, she said, "Thanks for highlighting this critical issue, Jonathan. The FT data underscores a worrying decline in core cognitive skills, reasoning, focusing, learning among both teens and adults. Given your research on moral psychology and social media's impact on attention, I'm curious, how can we translate these insights into practical strategies that individuals, educators, and organizations can adopt right now?" And this was exactly why I was drawn to Carolina's comment, because of her call to action around actionable strategies that we can use to address this slide, that we don't simply have to accept the slide in our intellectual capabilities as inevitable and likely to progress and get worse from here. In our brainstorming, we thought about how we could potentially address this slide. We talked about having perhaps sessions at the mental gym. We asked what would this mental gym look like? And we asked whether maybe echoing the work of Daniel Kahneman, we should bring friction-based learning back into our daily lives, and whether this need to pay more attention and to actively learn might be a way to address some of the slide into passive learning that screen time had brought upon. So Carolina, now that you're here, and this is going to be part one. So first we're going to expose the problem and talk about maybe what the data shows us and what your research and data has shown you in terms of some of the slippage of our intellectual capabilities. And then for part two, we'll look at some of the ways that we as humans, as parents, can try to address this slide, not just with our generation, but with that of others. So tell me what interested you in this topic, first of all.
Oh, great question. So it's more than what's interests me. It's my whole life work, research, and study human behavior and how do we adapt to changes and looking for ways to thrive based on those changes. Now, literally what attracted me from this post from Jonathan Haidt, it was as him being a professor, New York Times bestseller book publisher, that he published his books. Then what is the solution? It called me out. So a lot of people at his stature, they have the ability to show us or lead us the way as the vast majority of people. We're really listening to them, we're following them. So to me, it's a huge domain to figure out how can we start thinking clearly. How can we solve this problem? Because obviously this is a huge problem. If we look at the numbers, I think it's so scary that the difficulty to think and concentrate is increased so much in the past 30 years. So what's in it for the rest of our next generations? What's in it for your kids? What's in it for my kids? If we continue to go on this downward spiral inability to make decisions.
I mean, so much to unpack there. And let's just go back to the original source, this Financial Times article. We put a link to this in the show notes. So this asked the question whether humans had already passed peak brain power, which is, I think, a question that we've been asking a lot in the context of AI, whether AI is quickly really surpassing human intelligence and what that essentially means. But I think this question gets to a deeper problem, which is just around performance on tests, performance in reasoning and problem solving. That seems to be declining across both teenagers and adults. It's declining from both a numeracy and a literacy standpoint. And it's also that there seems to be a problem with cognitive attention, such as difficulty concentrating and trouble learning new things. So to me, they're related, but they're also two different issues. So just in terms of the decline in test scoring, numeracy and literacy, how much do you attribute that to just a decline in the education system, over reliance on, say, calculators, etc.? Because we would generally think we're getting more education today than previous generations.
Great question. I'm not sure if it's the tools, personally. I think it's more like we're not challenging our brains enough. We're not putting them in thinking labs. In a sense, we have, I will say, perhaps in the last 2 generations, 30 to 40 years, let's say, we are becoming to more just kind of like presenting information to people in a silver platter instead of involving them in the thinking process. You know, we can tell somebody until our face turns blue how to do something, but are we really just involving them, getting that hands-on creativity? Give me an idea. How would you solve it? What did the medieval times look like? Not just telling me something. And to me, the downgrade process of not really doing that well in tests, a lot of the testing today is just repeating information that we're being told, but not enhancing. How would you have solved that problem if you were back in the 5th century of the world? What would you have done back in the Renaissance? And then you start thinking and bringing curiosity. Oh, how can I bring that learning from the past and connect it to today? And then we start collecting. That's the beauty of math and data. We can always collect it back and bring it back to today. As we know, history repeats itself. So if we start bringing that more into the table to education, are we educating to repeat what's in a textbook? Or are we educating to enhance more expanded thinking? And how can we have solved the problem back then if we were in that situation, for example?
So interesting. And I think that sounds like that kind of almost Socratic method you mentioned in terms of asking question-based education. Certainly that's been around for centuries. I think it's been few enough institutions actually implement it. And some of this could be a factor of test taking, test scoring, a focus on test scores that maybe has changed the emphasis from some of this exploratory learning. But I think one of the issues that this article highlights is just the sheer attention span deficit, that there seems to be trouble with deep thinking, trouble with concentration, and then associated with that, a trouble learning new things. Do you think, I mean, we say anecdotally that the next generation has attention span of a goldfish, or that everybody's thinking in much shorter cycles. Have you observed that in your studies, that there is genuinely a reduction in attention span across all generations?
Absolutely, 100%. So I call it the Dory of the world, if anybody has watched Nemo. And to me, that's the pandemic of the world today. It's the lack of attention span and to just sit and process information. And that's where I love Daniel Cunningham's work. It's like, are we being proactive with information that we're getting? It's very easy to just read something and right away have an opinion and just have it come back. Adam Grant mentions this in his book. I believe I read all of his, but I believe on the Think Again book by Adam Grant. And I think there is one graph in there that he calls it Mount Stupid. And I'm not saying that we're stupid. Like, let's just pass that. I'm just literally quoting him, and it's right on his book. But what to me that is like as soon as just we have now this false idea, in my perception, that we get to have certain idea of something, and right away we become subject matter experts. So then we struggle to bring the knowledge into action. And yes, to answer your question, 100%. And it's scary because it's not just in teenagers. I hear parents saying, "Is my teenagers, is it cell phones? I'm bringing the cell phone in front of your face. It's the pings, it's the notifications." No, it's us. We're forgetting that we're decision makers. And we're allowing technology, we're allowing the noise out there. Cunningham's last book was called Noise before he passed away. And he was talking about it. And I see it an incremental change since the beginning of this year, 2025 to now. It's increased so much. So everybody believes what any artificial intelligence is telling them instead of stopping to process it.
That critical thinking layer, which I think is what we're trying to teach people to scrutinize what they're being given. And there's some other really adjacent, I think, changes in the way education is occurring today. And there's many issues just even when we're just exposing the problem. One of those is reading and changing approach to reading, changing volume of reading, changing complexity of reading that is being done. For example, the New York Times, there's an article there we will also link to in the show notes where they speak about the percentage of fourth graders or eighth graders, normal milestones from measuring reading that score below basic. And even the startling statistic around adults and their ability to read. Can you give us some insight into what the stats are telling us about reading?
Oh, the stats about reading are scary. And then really not only that is scary, is that the reality, I don't know if it's happening to you every time that you talk to people, is that people don't tend to really understand what is being asked of them. So it's not so much to reading. The stats is the New York Times reports that it's about 30% of the fourth graders and 35% of the eighth graders that read below basic. I live in Miami and I was in a meeting with one of the council members for the education system. And on the first side, she was talking about how proud she was that the Miami-Dade County was doing so much more in reading. When I asked her about the basics, she goes, "Oh, we stayed the same as last year." Well, how am I celebrating that 30% of our students at grade 4, they cannot read the level? And then when we compare it, and that's just for the United States, when we compare it to the rest of the world, in the United States, we're even at a lower level than most of other countries, even developing countries.
And I've seen some statistics around teachers having to change the curriculum because the current generation cannot absorb the reading material that they would have assigned years ago, that they have to actually dial down the level because of this reading. And also some staggering statistics around the percentage of, say, 15-year-olds that have read a book in the past year. And the articles we have that we've linked to will show just how some of those statistics are dropping. So reading is dropping. The education itself, obviously, we did have the disruption of education through COVID, remote learning, which we know did have a serious impact on certain members of the educational community. And particularly, it was not equally felt either, that some segments struggled more than others. What did you see in the study of education post-COVID when it shifted to remote learning or during COVID?
So post-COVID and during COVID, number one, what I saw the most is an increased decline on just reading the comprehension. But at the same time, one of the things that it continues to persist is the lack of the ability of people to connect and just have a regular conversation with that curiosity. And it's like, "Oh, tell me more." It's almost like the pandemic almost brought in a change in the habits of how we connect, or perhaps not the habits, just the ability. To me, it's essential. And there's enough studies. I did a LinkedIn post and a research that came out, I think, in March, that our chances of a stroke will diminish by 55% by just having true connections, much more than exercise, much more than diet, much more than a high blood pressure. So just that COVID, and to me, that's highly correlated with if you're not able to connect and ask another human those questions, that curiosity, tell me more, what does that mean? Then right away, we're not learning more because we're not being challenged.
So setting the bar too low. And I think that's also maybe a danger with AI as well, is that to what extent do you think we've become defeatist? I say, well, what's the point? of me learning this or that, because all I have to do and all I'll ever have to do is do a search or check AI or ask Grok, and Grok will always have the better answers. So is that kind of almost a self-defeating thing that we know that our bar is coming down? And we will in part two address how we can switch that around. But what do you think AI is kind of contributing to this sense of defeatism?
Well, let me just ask you a question back to that. How do you feel when you're just having a conversation? And I just asked a question like this on LinkedIn yesterday to somebody else that was talking about a relationship conversation, Socratic conversation with AI. So how do you personally will feel? So I'm going to put it back on you. If you were just getting instructions and directions from AI instead of you thinking clearly, like in here, somehow we have a script for our podcast and somehow we're evolving and coming up with different topics and perhaps not even in the script. I'm not even looking at the script anymore. I'm looking at you, connecting with you with the conversation.
Yeah, how do I feel if I'm having a conversation with AI? I know I'm communicating with a machine. I know that it is going to be scraping other content, unoriginal content that's already out there, that it will be sending me some kind of a formulaic answer, and that I think I'll be getting a very generic answer. I will devalue what I'm getting back from AI. But that's me, and I'm at the generation I'm in my 50s. I think
Right.
my teenage daughters, my daughters in their 20s, they may well communicate with ChatGPT as a de facto therapist, and they may not devalue what they're getting back. So I would always, at this point, I will always value human conversation much more, but that could be a generational thing.
But let's just connect back to what you were saying. And I forget the word exactly, but you're saying it's kind of like we're not saying demoralizing, but that we're just letting AI to think for us. So let's just having a conversation is one thing, and then creating an idea because it is a tool. But how would you feel if you're not creating? Do you think your daughter's generation will feel if they're not creating, if they're not coming up with a cool idea?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, certainly there's a lot of creativity. I mean, we may focus on reading and what's not there, but then if we look at what is there in this generation, and they are creating actively and energetically in other ways, and whether that's through, because of these shorter, maybe attention spans, their ability to glean an idea very quickly, the ability for that idea to gain currency and become widespread very quickly, whether that's trends or fashion or hypes, really capturing imagination very quickly. And I do think that that's another skill, because there's a need to kind of really kind of almost separate what's hype, and they seem to be able to keep up with that. So that's a very good thing. So I think other skills step in. And I do think most humans have a hunger for knowledge and for personal growth. I'm not sure that the stats we've been reading necessarily have adapted to how that personal growth is now manifesting.
Right. So then going back to what you were saying, are we, just coming secondary? And what's the point of learning what's the point of growing? I believe that's what you were asking. And then in my perspective, I don't think it is AI's fault. It's taking that away. Is that we are losing agency, and we humans are choosing to lose agency or not. We can use it as a creative tool. We can use it as a tool. I always compare it back to the Industrial Revolution, where we did not have that many cars. So would you go today without cars, without airplanes, without helicopters, without jets? We have to start looking at it as a tool and not a replacement for humans, in my belief, because it's just, again, it's another calculator. It's just a much faster calculator. And if we become complacent to just saying, oh, it's okay, what's the point of me learning? What's the point of me reading? What's the point of me understanding what the output I'm receiving from any type of platform from AI? Then we're at risk of just being misled. And one of the main things about humans is that we're biased. We're all biased. If we don't learn how to think, how to read, how to process that information, then we're going to completely lose agency. And that's where a lot of the doom thinkers or speakers think, oh, AI is going to replace humans. Well, only those humans that are choosing to lose agency for their own decision.
So interesting. And I think I'm going to go back to that New York Times article, because a lot of it is very catastrophic, some of the reasoning in that around. The title, as a reminder, is Producing Something This Stupid is the Achievement of a Lifetime. It speaks by David Brooks, an opinion columnist. It speaks about reading the deficiencies, the change of test scores, And it does give an interesting quotation from the author of Stolen Focus, Johann Hari, who says the world is complex and requires steady focus to be understood. It needs to be thought about and comprehended slowly. And it speaks about the inability, we talked about attention span, to actually gain some of that focus. What really I would think of in counterbalance to this is, first of all, some of the reading is not necessarily being done in the same way. It may not be from books, it may be from websites, or maybe digested in an audio way. We know that podcasts have become quite a source of critical reasoning, and we're doing one here, but they are a new source of information digested in an audio fashion. So that's one thing. And he also bemoans in this article the death of curiosity. He speaks, and we were relying on decades of incuriosity, decades of not cracking a book, decades of being impervious to evidence. I happen to think that's kind of a hyperbolic and exaggerated summary of where we stand, because I don't think we are incurious as a people. I think there are aspects, maybe some segments of the political spectrum may not be curious about new learning and other people and global travel. But I think we travel more. The percentage of Americans owning passports is probably somewhat much higher. And I think maybe we don't have to be as curious because we're bombarded with so many new experiences. But would you say that's perhaps overstating it, some of this complaint about disintegration of our abilities?
So again, to me, it's highly exaggerated. I work with adults and teens all the time. And I have to say, compared to 30 years ago, 20 years ago, people are reading less. Yes, there is a massive amount of information being presented to us in many different ways. A lot of people are going to be listening to these podcasts while they're driving, they're jogging, they're cooking, they're even having a conversation with somebody else. But at the same time, and you said something, perhaps we don't have to be as curious. Actually, curiosity, and that's where I bounced back to you with a question about AI. I was curious. How is your relationship? How do you see your relationship with AI? And then you spoke about different generations, yourself, your daughters, etc. But curiosity is what really, really sparks humans to discover their own passion. And that's what brings innovation. That's what brings stability. So the opposite of not having to be as curious is where we're losing agency. And that's where we give agency either to the cell phone, as many people say, to Instagram or social media, or to AI. What's the point anymore? It's because we're choosing not to be curious. But as Carol Dweck's research on mindset, on a growth mindset, and as you said earlier, most humans want to grow, they want to evolve. We're evolutionary human beings. So we don't have to be less curious with more. We have to be more curious. With a lot of my clients, I teach them to use different prompts with all different kind of AI and question AI and say, no, this is not what I'm telling you about. Bring your curiosity and expand it to start creating more solutions to the problems that they're having.
Very interesting. I think one of the issues is getting back to focus. I always think, that like anything, social media, social networks, there are advantages. We can connect more. The key is not that being the only interface. That screen should not be the only interface. And I think with back to office mandates, etc., we're actually seeing a bit of a pendulum swinging back now in terms of valuing that human connection. And, we've seen some cultures take a nosedive in work environments because of that, just that fragmented nature of the teams. And when it comes to, say, cell phones as a vehicle, one thing I would look to is the increased leisure time that we have, the increased focus on self-care, and the increased focus on things like meditation and yoga and other ways to actually maybe regain that mental stillness that the pressure of daily life is squeezing out. So I think there's a lot more focus certainly on, I'm thinking of what other trends in the pandemic, Wordle, for example, and the brain training word game that, became hugely popular. And because of this, I think, again, this constant backdrop we're seeing of ways to avert brain decline. In some cases, it's old age. And I think an aging society is going to be more surrounded by ways to, I think, just very public ways of seeing that. How do we address brain decline? I think we're seeing much more focus on continuous learning, reskilling. And again, AI and screens and internet connectivity has really facilitated that. So I think we have to kind of not be, I think, necessarily swayed. One of the areas I thought was fascinating in one of your LinkedIn posts was when you spoke specifically about some of this different approach to focus. And in particular, you used two words. Well, one word I know, the word absorb, and you talked about the word adsorb, which I think is when you don't fully digest an idea. Instead, it's more of a kind of a temporary familiarity with the idea or a temporary holding on to the idea. Can you talk us through the difference between those two concepts?
Absolutely. So when we absorb, so that comes from how our brains work and the neuroplasticity with our brains. So imagine that we are like a sponge, right? So to be able to absorb information, whatever it is, we have to be able to have a space to absorb more water as a sponge, more information, and be able to create those neural links to something that it can be applicable into action. Oh, I can relate to that. And that's why I link it back to the curiosity from that New York Times article that you were mentioning is we humans tend to naturally just want to have more absorption space because it nurtures us, it feeds us, it gets us to be more creative. So the difference between absorb, going back to Adam Grant, which I think he points it beautifully, is when we get to be on that peak on the Mount Stupid. Basically, it's like, oh, I know this. I got the information. I'm an expert on thinking. I know exactly how to build resilience. I read the definition. I know exactly how to do it. And then we go back out there in the world and start magically telling the whole world that we're a subject matter expert on thinking and resilience, for example. But then when we go to really apply it, how? How do I apply it? What do I do with that information? Then we cannot turn it into something that is actionable. And if it's not actionable, then what's the point of actually having that idea of something? Because it doesn't turn into something that is applicable over time. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think where that's exactly what we're going to be addressing in part two is ways to get to that kind of deep absorption, which is really essential to take it to the next level. If you want to develop a concept, you really do need to fully understand it. And I think, surface level knowledge and even books themselves are, available now on Blinkist or in sort of short, sort of a cliff note form, or even AI itself can, of course, summarize a book and even put it in a podcast form. So you can really get the highlights. But what you're missing is the nuance, is the character development, and is almost the patience that you need to see a character develop. And I suppose there's an interesting, just as I was discussing this, there is an interesting counter narrative we're seeing, which is that the huge increase in television content and with streaming services and the ability to look at a whole box set in one go, that seems to be really flourishing now, these kind of deeper, more protracted character development in, say, a 6-part TV series than in a 90-minute film or movie. So I think maybe, yes, reading is not the vehicle whereby we are giving patience to see themes develop. But I would say that maybe television is. I think we still have the ability to be patient with ideas.
Well, let me just go back to that on that one, because what reading gives us is the ability to really absorb information and then just have it like it's almost like our brain is kind of filtering the information in a different process that if we're watching it or if we're listening to it. Okay. And there has been many people, I'm not going to go into, the type of learners or not, because I think we will spend the whole day talking about that. Because to me, it's depending on how that person is feeling that day, how engaged they are in the topic, etc. There's many, many variables, and there is a lot of different controversial theories about the type of learners or not learners. But at the same time, if what we're trying to, going back to what people are saying, that we're not engaging with information, we're not absorbing the information, we're not processing the information, we're not applying the information that we are absorbing to turn it into something that is applicable, we need to be able to just slow our brains down, engage our system too, that Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky taught us brilliantly, to just slow the process and then question which is really hard to do when you're watching something just on TV, absorbing information on a video, because then you have to press pause. But if you read and you question and then you write a note about, oh, what does this mean? Or highlight it and then write on the side of the book or on your tablet and you question mark and you add a note, then that is slow process. It's really saying, okay, what's missing here? How can I use this? Should I continue reading this book or not reading this book? Oh, I don't agree with this book. I don't like the tone. I don't agree with the social context or whatever it is. And then you move on into something. So to me, there's a huge difference between absorbing information from a video, which is very valuable, is very useful. But if we want to just pause and question something, we either have to pause the video, pause the reading, pause the podcast, pause the audiobook, and then question ourselves. What's in it for me here? Like, I always talk about the movie, Show Me the Money. Show me the money, but not in regards to finance. It's show me the money, what's money in the power of the knowledge that I'm absorbing.
That's fascinating. And I think I probably am one of those people that will pause a podcast or an audiobook and go back and re-listen, because you need to realize that sometimes you're actually going through these ideas too quickly. And I think what I've noticed in my podcasts when I've spoken to people about who are the people that have had an influence on you, I'd say a theme that I have probably 30-40% of the time is that person that's had an influence is someone who has taught my podcast guest how to think. And I think that we are not born knowing how to think. I mean, some of us have different strengths, weaknesses, etc., different strengths versus others. Some of us are more curious. Some of us are more driven. But I do think that it is possible to be taught how to think and taught how to question. And that's where those classic teachers, coaches, bosses can come in. And I think that the onus is on that generation who maybe know a thing or two about thinking to pass those disciplines on.
Just to circle back, especially because I think it links together with what we're talking here about the problem. And a few weeks ago, I did a talk that is called Preparing for a Modern Society with AI Ethically. And I'm just going to be fairly quick on this. In my audience, I had people of all ages, because it was invited and open for all ages. All curious minds is all the only thing I asked. All curious minds is what it said, and everyone of all ages are welcome. And I was happy to see people in the audience from 17 to 75, because I asked them their age. And the fascinating part of that talk that I did, and I do talks in a conversational manner because I like to engage the audience, just like you're engaging with me. It's just not one way. And then the two 17-year-olds, they were saying they wanted to learn more about AI. They wanted to know how to prepare for this modern society. They wanted to prepare. That's why they came. What's the best case scenario for me to study in university, etc. So they were curious. But the fascinating part is what they brought in the conversation is, I want to learn how to think more, because I don't want AI to replace me. So thinking about what you just said, we can all learn how to think. And that is what is more needed today than ever. It's, in my opinion, even 17-year-olds are coming and asking and saying, I don't want AI to think for me. I want to think for myself. So it is a problem, but there's also that other side of it. There's hope, because the news bombards us with all of this information. But in a practical way, in my own work practice, I see a lot of teenagers and adults that say, I want to think. And that's why we're having this conversation.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.